It's late afternoon. You're driving down a back road in Texas. The heat feels like it's pressing against the windows of your car, every breath of air dry and suffocating. The horizon is nothing but endless fields, the occasional withered tree, and mile after mile of nothing. Finally, you see it, a sagging 2-story farmhouse standing alone in the middle of nowhere. Its windows are broken, the wood is warped and grey, the porch sinking into the dirt like the house itself is trying to disappear. You stop, climb the steps, and push open the door. Inside, the air hits you like a wall, thick, stale, rotten. The living room is dark except for one broken beam of sunlight cutting across the floor. A couch sits in the middle of the room. At first, you think it's just old leather, but when you look closer, your stomach drops. It isn't leather, it's skin. Human skin, stitched together in uneven patches. A lamp on a side table has a lampshade, but it's made from bone and skull fragments. And then, from somewhere deeper inside the house, you hear it. A sound so violent and unmistakable, it freezes you in place. The roar of a chainsaw. That image Leatherface, stepping out of the shadows, chainsaw in hand, is burned into horror history. But here's the thing. Leatherface wasn't just a Hollywood invention. He was inspired by a real man. And the true story is far darker than the movie ever showed. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre hit theaters in 1974, it was marketed as based on a true story. Audiences believed it because it looked real. It felt raw, documentary-like, almost as if you were watching something you weren't supposed to see. But the truth was different. The film wasn't a retelling of one actual crime. It was stitched together, just like Leatherface's mask, from a collection of real horrors. And at the center of it all was one man, Ed Gein. He didn't live in Texas. He never owned a chainsaw. But his crimes were so grotesque, so unthinkable, that they became the blueprint for some of cinema's most terrifying characters. Norman Bates in Psycho, Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, and most famously, Leatherface. This is the unfiltered, disturbing true story of how one lonely farm boy from Wisconsin became the monster behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Ed was born in 1906 in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a tiny rural community where life was simple, slow, and isolated. To most outsiders, Plainfield looked like any other small town in America. But for Ed, life at home was anything but ordinary. His father, George, was a violent alcoholic who drifted from job to job, barely keeping the family afloat. His mother, Augusta, was the real force in the household. A strict religious fanatic, Augusta preached fire and brimstone daily. She told Ed and his older brother Henry that the world was wicked, that women, other than herself, were evil, and that they should have no friends, no relationships, no distractions. Ed obeyed. He adored his mother. She controlled him so completely that while other kids played ball in the street, Ed sat inside listening to sermons about sin and damnation. When his father died in 1940, Ed stayed on the farm with his mother and brother. 4 years later, Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a brush fire. Many locals whispered that Ed had something to do with it. That left Ed alone with Augusta until 1945, when she died of a stroke. For Ed, that loss was catastrophic. His entire world revolved around his mother. When she was gone, he was left adrift. He boarded up her bedroom, leaving it spotless like a shrine untouched. But everywhere else, the farmhouse began to rot. Piles of junk filled the rooms. The wallpaper peeled. The air grew heavy with mold. And here's the chilling part. On the surface, Ed didn't seem like a monster. He seemed like an odd but harmless bachelor. He worked as a handyman around Plainfield, fixing fences, repairing barns, painting houses. He shoveled snow for neighbors. He even babysat children. Yes, parents in town actually trusted Ed Gein with their kids. People described him as polite, quiet, and a little strange, but never dangerous. By day, Ed was mowing lawns and telling bedtime stories. By night, he was fantasizing about death, dismemberment, and resurrection. At night, Ed sat alone under the weak glow of a kerosene lamp, flipping through books and pulp magazines. Not just any books, medical texts, stories about Nazi war experiments, and cheap horror rags filled with tales of death and dismemberment. He was fascinated, but more than that, he was inspired. In those late-night hours, Ed developed a craving. He wanted to touch death, to reshape it, to keep pieces of it for himself. But the cemeteries in Plainfield were too close, and no one watched them at night. So Ed began to dig. Under the cover of darkness, he drove his old truck out to the local graveyard. He knew exactly whose graves to target. Women, often middle-aged, who reminded him of his mother. Sometimes he dug all night, his lantern barely visible between the headstones. He pried open coffins, hauled bodies out of the earth, and loaded them into his truck. Then he drove them back to the farmhouse. Inside those walls, Plainfield's polite handyman became something else entirely. He experimented. He skinned corpses carefully, like a butcher. He tanned hides the way farmers did with animal pelts. But he wasn't just collecting trophies, he was creating. One skull became a bowl, another a centerpiece. He stretched human skin over chair frames and upholstered furniture. He made lampshades, masks, even belts. In one shoebox, he preserved parts of women he thought were most important. And in his darkest obsession, he began stitching together a woman's suit, a grotesque outfit of skin that he would wear shuffling around the farmhouse, pretending to be his mother. But eventually, the graves weren't enough. Ed wanted something fresher, something alive. In December of 1954, tavern owner Mary Hogan vanished. The bar was found empty, her purse still on the counter, the cash register untouched. Rumors swirled, but no one had answers. Ed even joked about it. Neighbors later remembered him chuckling and saying, "She's not missing. She's over at my place right now." Everyone laughed it off. Just Ed being weird old Ed. 3 years later, on a freezing November morning in 1957, Bernice Worden, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her truck was still parked outside. A trail of blood led across the floor. The last receipt written that morning, for antifreeze. The name on it, Ed Gein. That was the moment everything unraveled. Police drove out to Ed's farm to question him. What they found was worse than anything they could have ever imagined. In a shed behind the house, Bernice's body hung upside down from the rafters, gutted like a deer, her torso split open. And inside the farmhouse, the graveyard Ed had been building for years was finally revealed. Chairs, lamps, bowls, masks, all made from human remains. The truth was out. The quiet handyman, the man who fixed fences and babysat children, was the butcher of Plainfield. Ed confessed quickly. He admitted to grave robbing. He admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. But he insisted he wasn't a murderer in the traditional sense. He claimed he wasn't doing it for pleasure. He said he was trying to become his mother by wearing the skin of women. Psychiatrists described him as schizophrenic, delusional, and profoundly disturbed. He was declared legally insane and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He would spend the rest of his life there, shuffling through the halls in hospital pajamas, reading magazines, and occasionally speaking politely to staff. He died in 1984 at age 77. The farmhouse didn't survive long. In 1958, before it could become a morbid tourist attraction, locals burned it to the ground. All that was left was ash, rubble, and the memory of what had been uncovered inside. But by then, had already spread far beyond Plainfield. Ed never lived in Texas. He never used a chainsaw, but his crimes had a long shadow. Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, used him as the direct inspiration for Norman Bates, the quiet, lonely man obsessed with his mother. Later, Thomas Harris borrowed from Gein when creating Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, a killer who made a woman suit from skin. But perhaps the most iconic inspired creation was Leatherface. In the early 1970s, director Tobe Hooper was searching for a horror concept that captured the chaos of the era. America was in turmoil. The Vietnam War was on TV every night. Political corruption was dominating headlines, and trust in authority was eroding. Hooper remembered reading about Ed Gein. The image of a man wearing the faces of his victims was too terrifying to ignore. That image became the seed of Leatherface. The chainsaw, that came from Hooper's own life. One day, stuck in a crowded hardware store, he found himself staring at a rack of chainsaws. He imagined, just for a moment, firing one up and cutting a path through the crowd. That thought scared him so much, he gave the weapon to his villain. And the cannibal family, that was Hooper's exaggeration of Gein's loneliness. Instead of one man, he created a whole clan of killers, hidden away in rural Texas. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre premiered in 1974, Hooper claimed it was based on true events. It wasn't, but audiences believed it. They left theaters convinced Leatherface was real. The movie caused an uproar. Some theaters banned it entirely. In others, audience members fainted, vomited, or bolted for the exits. Critics called it filth, depravity, a snuff film disguised as fiction. But others recognized its brilliance. The shaky handheld camera, the washed-out colors, the low-budget grime. It didn't look like a movie. It looked like something you weren't supposed to see. For decades afterward, the myth persisted. Somewhere in Texas, there was a family of cannibals with a chainsaw-wielding son named Leatherface. The truth is that it was inspired by one lonely grave robber in Wisconsin who was almost stranger. Today is still infamous. He's not remembered as a serial killer because technically he was convicted of only 2 murders. But his crimes were so bizarre, so disturbing, that he became something worse, a cultural legend. His story inspired dozens of films, novels, and songs. His name still sends a chill down the spine of true crime readers. What unsettled people most wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. Neighbors described him as polite, even helpful. He fixed fences, shoveled driveways, and babysat their kids. He was, to Plainfield, a strange but harmless handyman. But inside his farmhouse, he was upholstering chairs with skin, carving masks from faces, and walking around in the flesh of the dead. That contrast, the ordinary on the outside, the monstrous on the inside, is exactly why his story still terrifies us. So next time you hear that chainsaw roar at the start of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, remember, Leatherface never existed, but Ed did. And while Leatherface was a product of Hollywood, Ed was just a man in Wisconsin. A man who wore faces as masks, who made trophies out of corpses. He reminded the world that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the woods. They're living right next door. If you thought this story was horrifying, wait until you hear the real nightmare that inspired A Nightmare on Elm Street. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode in this series, where we uncover the true stories behind the most terrifying movies ever made.